I think this is on. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. We're about to start. Welcome. My name is Mary Favrette. I'm visiting here from Indiana University. And it's my privilege this evening to introduce our panelists for this discussion of family novels, which I think is about family and novels about family. It's part of the Writing Live series here at Columbia, and it's been sponsored by the Heyman Center for the Humanities. As some of you may have had occasion today on this gorgeous spring afternoon to reflect on what it means to be brought back to life. But those who've read the novel or seen the stage version of Testament of Mary may begin to question the value of such raising of the dead. Lazarus, called forth from the grave, appears wretchedly feeble, hardly able to walk or speak. He howls and then slides towards a second death. What sort of gift is this resurrection? And what sort of power is it at work in bringing up the bodies, as another novelist has put it? Our panelists are practitioners of such power, or perhaps of a power more felicitous than that which raised Lazarus. Because they hardly need introduction, I will only barely introduce them. Julie Orringer is a writer and the author of a recent novel, The Invisible Bridge, centered on a Jewish-Hungarian family during the Holocaust. She's also the author of the highly regarded short story collection, How to Breathe Underwater. Both of these are published by Knopf. These days, she's at work on the life of Varian Fry, an American journalist who, from occupied France, helped ferry thousands out of the country and out of the hands of the Gestapo. Deborah Cohen is a writer and a professor of modern history at Northwestern University, where she holds the Peter B. Ritzma Chair in Humanities. She too has written about World War II in her first book, The War Come Home, and about domestic objects in her second book, Household Gods, the British and Their Possessions. Yet it is her third book, especially, about domestic secrets that gives her a seat in the front of this room. Exhuming sealed and buried records, Family Secrets, Shame and Privacy in Modern Britain has been praised by no one less than Hilary Mantel as a timely and absorbing book. It invites us to inquire more closely into when and why families keep secrets and guard their privacy. Colm Tóibín, the author of the aforementioned Testament of Mary, a novel and a play currently running at the Walter Kerr Theater and just nominated for a Tony Award. I cannot count how many bodies he has called to life in fiction and drama and essays, but they include the aforementioned Lazarus, as well as the Blessed Virgin Mary and Henry James. He too has opened and closed a wealth of family secrets and placed them within the larger secrets of nations and religions. Mr. Tóibín is a member of the Royal Society of Literature and the current Irene and Sidney B. Silverman Professor of Humanities at Columbia. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Mary for that lovely introduction, and to Eileen Galuli, who had the idea of this panel and made it happen. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. But I'm not booming, right? Okay, good. So if I could start by asking each of you, in all of your novels and short stories and the rest, one of the things that critics have called attention to is the way in which you are able to summon up place as well as psychology. And I think it's clear enough in some ways how one kind of imagines a place, and we've talked about that before, but I'm wondering actually if you can talk a little bit about how you imagine psychologies, because one of the things that I esteem so much in both of your work is the moment when, for the historian, it feels like, oh, you got that exactly right. You've had people do something that is counterintuitive, but actually makes emotional sense for the past. And I'm wondering if we could just start there, maybe.
Sure. I mean, can everyone hear me on this mic? Is the mic on? The mic is on. Okay. I think that the phenomenon that you just mentioned in fiction is one that I've become a little bit more aware of in the past couple of years. The idea that one of the things that most intrigues us, I think, in novels and short stories is when characters behave in ways that they shouldn't, either because the actions that surround them call for different acts on their part, or because they're doing something that we are rooting against, or because they're doing something that psychologically doesn't make sense on the surface. When that happens in a piece of fiction, it's often happened to me as a writer as a kind of surprise, where I make a decision that's counterintuitive somehow, but then that I have to ask a question about. And the question is, why is that the thing that seems inevitable, despite the fact that it's not what would logically proceed from what came before? And from that identification of the act that seems to occur despite, a lot of narrative energy proceeds. And I think that the conjunction between that and the placement of these narratives in history has to do sometimes with the fact that when we come to know a historical moment deeply the way that you hope that you do when you're writing a novel about it, sometimes all of a sudden a character will act in a way that belongs to the historical moment, but that isn't the decision that we might make in our present historical moment. And so I think, in a sense, we have to be open to that kind of surprise in the course of our coming to know the time in which we're writing somehow.
That's an interesting idea, that you need more than anything else to release narrative energy. And in order to do that, you have to keep thinking as well as keep feeling. And so I started with the idea, I had seen it a number of times, of what it would be like for a woman in the 1950s in Ireland to attempt to live her life properly without the constraints imposed on her. And that it wasn't a simple thing of saying, you know, what if you have a woman who's a mother who does not have a maternal instinct? But what if she does have one? But if another instinct arises and almost on a whim, she wanders away from it into her own life, leaving behind everything. And but you have to be very careful in case that becomes just the story, you know, somebody doing the opposite of what they should do. That it has to release narrative energy that is sort of pure, or even maybe is impure, or is not too carefully thought out. In other words, you have to keep thinking, no, go back, go back, go back. Make her miss home. You know, make her be desperate to get away from home. And then when she's away, make her miss home. And when you have her missing home, forget about that for a while and see if something could distract her enough to forget about home. And then, even when she gets home after 20 years, that even though parts of her have changed, she's been in Spain, she's been painting, she's had love affairs, she's witnessed a great deal, that another part of her has not changed at all, that she's as big a snob before she left. She's as big a snob now as before she left. And she despises the same sort of people and things, that some things in her have frozen and some things have opened up. So you have to keep thinking, no, don't make this too easy each time you come to a narrative decision. Release some more energy by going the opposite way again to see where that would take you. And then the second book I wrote, that novel is called The South. The second novel I wrote, called The Heather Blazing, has a judge. And of course, the first thing you need to do with the judge is make him feel really guilty. And then you can start working, but not too guilty. Sometimes he's pretty good at being a judge. Other times, he just doesn't know anything or believe in anything. But other times, certainty comes back. And you move, and you move, and you move. Each moment you give it its proper... It's proper what? It's proper amount of emotion released that will seem plausible and that will also hit the reader's nervous system in a way which might matter.
And I think that has to do with actual human complexity, you know?
Yeah.
I think that it's because people contain contradictions that those kinds of narrative decisions are possible, you know? in the case of The Invisible Bridge, I wanted to have this, it made sense to me that this young man, this 23-year-old man, was going to fall in love. But I didn't know that he was going to fall in love with somebody who was 8 years older than he was. But then the real mystery was how to have her fall in love with him, because that, of course, made no sense at all. And yet to be able to learn how both of those characters could contain enough contradiction for those things to happen. And going back is the key, because there's always some source from which those contradictions spring inside a character. You know, in the case of this woman, it was that she had kind of lost her youth, and so by being with somebody younger, she could reclaim it. And in the case of this young man, he was sort of striving towards a vision of himself that wanted to embrace the kind of seriousness that being with an older woman would entail. And so it's all there, but you don't know when you make those decisions for the characters where it is exactly. And so it's not just, I think, it's creating that sense of energy within the character and for the reader, but it's also maintaining it for yourself as a writer, because there are these questions that persist about the characters that drive you through the writing of a thing too. Right.
Can I take this up actually from another angle, which is related, I think, to the narrative energy question? Colm has written very powerfully on the novel as a pattern and on the fallacy of trying to connect the life to particular kinds of characters in the book, right? And so I'm curious, for both of you, thinking about these kinds of patterns, what role familial relationships are serving in these novels for you, especially after the 1960s and 1970s. So, you know, if in the 19th century and early 20th century novel, as Colm is arguing, right, the protagonists have to enact this drama of self-reliance. So what now happens after the 60s and 70s? What's the family novel, in other words, after the families have been transformed in the last 40 years?
Well, they haven't for me in the sense that I was partly brought up in the 19th century. You know, in other words, brought up in a house with no telephone, with no television for quite some time. I mean, I suppose I was 9 or 10 before there was a television, with no central heating. So there was a fire lighting. If you needed to be warm, you went into the room where the fire was. And a sense of an extended family I mean, the door was never locked. So anyone could come into the house, and aunts and uncles were permanently wandering in and out. And so feudalism was still going on. And also in a town of 6,000 people, where 3 of my grandparents had been born in the town. So that I had, you know, it was very much a very traditional society. I mean, not to mention Catholicism, which you didn't even mention because it was so it was just there. I mean, you just didn't even think about it. It was just the daily business of prayers and belief. I mean, there was no one who didn't believe. We had Protestants living next door, but they were very unusual. There were, you know, and they even had a fridge, which we didn't have. Having those roots in the night and watching the sort of slow disruption of those roots, I suppose, has been interesting and fruitful. Of course, you know, with Julie, where the problem with Ireland is if you try and write about it, you have 2 big problems. I mean, you know, a country where, I mean, officially we didn't fight in the First World War, and officially we were neutral, if you don't mind, in the second one. So that what you have is a sort of 20th century dullness. I mean, once independence comes in 23, you settle down into a sort of dullness, into a neutrality, into a limbo, into a greyness. What can you do with this? Sometimes there's very little. You think, oh my, you know, you don't wish a war on anyone, but you do realize that not having had that experience that everyone else in Europe had, with the exception, well, Spain and Portugal had their own cataclysms, but to have had a peaceful time from, I mean, the time my mother was born, my father was born, you know, right through, was such an unusual experience anywhere in the world. And to try and write novels from that means that you have to go really searching sometimes. As I did, say, with that first novel, I had to go to Spain. I had to find the remnants of the Spanish Civil War, because we didn't have we didn't have anarchists in the country where I came from, so I had to go looking for them. But once I had done that, I realized that's probably a mistake. I should find, there is something enough in dullness to work from. If Jasper Johns can have a show called Grey, and he's such a great man with colour, I can write a novel which is just all grey and see if I can get away with it. Do you know what I mean? But I mean, this idea of having had, if you set your characters in these years and you in those countries, you have such an amount of number of stories to tell. Did you?
Yes, but it also strikes me thinking about when you're writing about the 20th century that what ends up happening, particularly with regard to place and family, is that that family and place become kind of together something for the characters to be moving away from, in a sense. I mean, I'm thinking not just about the South, but also about Brooklyn, and about how there's this way in which the characters are sort of gathering this escape energy, in a sense. And there's always that tug back into the structure of the family, into the structure of the place that are so closely linked, you know? And I think that in a way there was a similar thing going on in The Invisible Bridge, but for different reasons politically, you know? One of the things that was interesting, I think, about what happened to the family in this book is that the way that it's disrupted because of historical and political factors kind of prefigures what happens to families later in the 20th century. That now it's very common for children to have to, to go to school far away from their families, and for families to be linked through over large distances and for reasons that aren't totally voluntary. But of course, in the case of this family, the reasons were quite largely involuntary, simply that the boys couldn't go to school in Hungary because of the quotas on Jewish students. And so they had to go abroad. And that happened to many, many families, hundreds of families in Hungary at that time. And so there was a kind of disruption in the cohesion of the family that happened before the war, and that was further exacerbated once the war started.
Well, and I think in The Invisible Bridge, the interesting thing that's happening is the way in which the significance of the family, right, is reduced on the one hand, right, with this experience of education abroad, but then the war brings it back, and so it raises this question, who is going to save you?
Yeah, right.
Right? And I mean, can I push you, Colm, actually a little bit more on that? Because, I mean, one version of telling Irish history, of course, would be all about conflict. And so in something like Blackwater Lightship, I'm struck by, there's this rift, but it takes until page, 170 until you know what has actually happened. And I'm wondering then how family is functioning as a way, as a pattern in the novel of plotting out conflict, reconciliation.
Yeah, my grandfather fought in the 1916 rebellion and was interned afterwards. And my uncle, who I was very close to and lived into the 90s, he fought in the Irish Civil War, which was a pretty brutal business, and he was on a hunger strike during that time. So that all of that was always there, and it was very useful. I mean, I used it in a novel, The Blackwater Lightship. Sorry, I used it in the novel, The Heather Blazing. But when I came to the novel, to write a novel, The Blackwater Lightship, I made a conscious decision to leave it out. That it was too easy almost in an Irish novel to start putting in references to this is where battles were fought, or this revolution affected everyone's life, because I wanted in a way to draw a deeper picture. And in order to do so, therefore, I wanted the family to be much more enclosed with almost no sense of an outside. If the outside began, it began sometime in the 1960s for them. There was no past before that. And fill it with things such as the arrival of the first cell phone in the house, which frightened the cats, which meant they had to run out of the house, the arrival of a television, the arrival of central heating, that those sort of things had to be presented in the book as A, organic, but B, very important in some way or other for shaking up this place. and then offer the characters a sort of an intensity in their relationship to each other. So there are only 6 characters. It takes place over 7 days. And I left Ireland out. I got Ireland and I said, I want you out of my book. I've had enough trouble from you, myself, and novelists have had enough trouble from you, because it's so easy to put in those ingredients of, for example, references to Protestants and Catholics, to sectarian warfare, to independence movements, to insurgencies of various sorts. I thought, I'm having none of it. I'm having, maybe the biggest outside force is a woman, and I remember it vividly. She was an American woman, used to come on TV on a Saturday night sometimes, on Irish TV, and she could tell the dead would talk through her. And I mean, seemingly she was very well known, but she could say, your sister, now your sister passed away, and she could tell you the whole story of your sister, and would say, yes, that's my sister. For us, this was magic beyond magic. So I left Catholicism out of the book. I left because I thought this story, actually, magic coming from the television from America, had much more to say than just if you had a priest knocking on the door, coming in to bully people, which I thought would be out of a central repository of Irish cliché. Leave priests out of your book for a change.
But this is, in fact, one of the things that we were talking about when we were chatting at McNally Jackson, that so much of the energy of a piece of fiction comes from what you leave out, and from what you're not.
Explain McNally Jackson, just because it's so interesting.
It was so interesting. It turned out that that Colm and I both participated in an issue, a translation issue of McSweeney's magazine, where we agreed to translate a story from a language that we may or may not have known. In my case, I agreed to translate from Hungarian, which I know sort of peripherally, and Colm translated from Spanish. And we ended up translating the same story.
So I did the first one, which I mistranslated and did loads of things too. I mean, I didn't really, I thought being faithful was rubbish, and then I passed it on to, what's he called, Peter Estenasi, who
Yes.
translated it using Google translation system, which made absolute rubbish of it into Hungarian from English.
And then I got it. And I think it was in German. After, Esterhazy translated from German after your...
Oh, somebody maybe got
translation.
it to translation to
That's
German, and they made a worse Hames out. I mean, they really did worse job.
Yes, right.
And then you got it. But the thing
That's
was,
right.
it remained the same in an odd sort of stable way,
Right.
no matter what we tried to do to it.
That's right.
Isn't that right?
Yes. And so, right, of course, so I got it as a complete disaster. And we both read our versions of this translation. So it was a dreadful embarrassment to me. But it made for some interesting discussion. And one of the things that, I don't know, I mean, I think that this is something that's spoken about more with short story writing, but I found it certainly to be true of novel writing too, that so much of the energy of the piece came from what was left out or what was suppressed in a way. And I thought about that so much hearing you talk about your work. Deborah and I were also colleagues at the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library, and so we were in fact working on these books at the same time, and we were there hearing you talk about your work, about how the secrets that these families had that were never discussed, that were just not part of the kind of overt family narrative, persisted so prominently in the kind of psychology of the family and in the development of the whole family narrative in a way. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's the question that I would bring back to you, which is just in thinking about the narratives that shaped your work for this book, how did you see those suppressed narratives kind of shaping or those secrets shaping the narratives that the families lived in a way?
Let me think about this and turn it to a question to you both.
Oh, that's not fair.
No,
You can
no,
answer,
I will think about it, but it leads so perfectly into the question I was going to ask you both, actually about managing knowledge and silence, which is something that you're both doing brilliantly. And so for Julie, for instance, the way in which who knows what is bobbing around in this family. Sometimes people who ought not to know things do know them, and then the entire drama that's playing around Clara's return, the question of, whether Andras ought to be telling her what he knows. And similarly, for Colm, the question of knowledge. In particular, I'm thinking about in The Story of the Night, where the question is, who has access to knowledge? Because that strikes me also as one of these patterns, or one of these moments of narrative energy. And while I'm thinking about how to answer Julie's question, will you guys talk about that a bit?
I covered the trial of Galtieri and the other generals in Buenos Aires. I went to the courtroom every day in 1985. And it being Argentina at that time, the court began at 3 in the afternoon. I don't know what they were doing in the morning. And it often went on until very late at night. And this is 1985, so I was 30 years old. And the courthouse was, uptown, and in order to get to the railway station, because the trains went, it being Argentina, the trains went through the night, and I was living out in the suburbs, so I could just go down to the railway station and get a train home. And you walk down through what they call the microcentro, and you discovered that it was filled with figures walking alone in the street. And there have been books written about this, the Argentine melancholy, the figure who walks alone, the solitude of Buenos Aires and all that. But no, it wasn't that. They were just gay, and they were looking for they were looking for someone. And some nights I was too, so it was great. And what I discovered was that none of them, and it became an almost mantra, it became like an alibi. People would say to you, no one knows I'm gay, no one will ever know I'm gay. I'm going to get married, I've got a girlfriend, I'm just out tonight, but no one will ever know. It's not going to happen. And I, of course, was sitting in the courtroom in the day, listening to accounts of torture and the disappearance of 30,000 people. And people were coming in and giving evidence saying we didn't know. We simply didn't realize that we thought that girl went to France. And the judge would say, well, but you must have seen that body was on the corner of your street. And there was one man said, yes, there was one sign we were given of what was happening. At night, in the police station down the road, we could all hear it, that they had connected the torture implements, which were electric, because it didn't have enough power in the building, to cars. And police cars would start revving with connected to cattle prods. And I mean, I went, hold on a minute. That noise was going through the night, and you were all in your houses saying, well, we didn't really know what was happening, but you must have seen who was going in and out of the, you must have seen something. And everyone would say, no, we didn't. And I kept meeting people who would also say, the funny thing is we didn't know about those disappearances until we all went on our holidays to France, and French people started to ask us about them. Because in Argentina, you see, no one knew. And this business of no one knew came twice to me. Once was, no one will ever know that I am gay, and this society did not know that this took place in front of its nose. And of course, the darkness, and both of them for me seemed an intolerable sort of burden to place on a society or an individual, the burden of not knowing or of not being able to release information. And it was very hard. I mean, what I had to try and do carefully was not connect them too obviously, the one and the other. But it was hard because there it was. So I set the novel in the aftermath of all that, when the knowledge was becoming clear, and when somebody was moving out of the space of the closet into a more open space sexually and personally, and the society was doing the same, but they both had to face what they had been through the previous decade in the society's life and in the protagonist's life. So, I mean, I was working, yes, out of a sort of attempt to connect the personal and the political at a time when I felt they were so connected and so close to each other that it wasn't hard to find images that brought them right into each other. So that's what I did in that book.
Can I just say something quickly about that, which is what's interesting to me is that there's latent familial knowledge, and that there's an exchange between Richard and Pablo about the father, about Pablo's father, right? And whether he knows. Richard says, well, of course he knows. And Pablo says, be careful, right?
Yeah.
So that you're endowing in a way.
Yeah, that they were involved in the silences, and Richard won't tell his mother that he's gay, and then he does tell her as an almost challenge to her. And then in the other family, no, the other family is completely locked into itself. And so, I think as a novelist, you can work with silence better than you can work with noise. Because you can, or work with revelation even, because you can show the reader what the character is thinking or feeling, and then you can show the reader what the character is not saying. And the gap between them can give you a sort of drama.
Right. Yeah, and I think that in The Invisible Bridge, the unspoken, or the subtext had to do with illusions of safety. And that, of course, was going on in Argentina at that time, too, because people didn't want to know what was happening, not only because it was so horrifying, but also simply because knowing endangered them in a way.
Yeah.
But I think that one of the things that was going on in this book is that there's both a familial pattern of willful suppression of the awareness of danger, and then there's a cultural suppression of the awareness of danger. And so what happens essentially is that the woman who Andras falls in love with and eventually married committed a crime in her youth, inadvertently, accidentally, but one that's considered a crime by the Hungarian authorities, and was in fact an act of self-defense after a horrific experience that she went through. And she fled the country, but then comes back years and years later because she's in love with this man and wants to marry him. And so then once she comes back to the country, she's in fact very soon after her life is placed in danger because her presence in the country becomes known. She doesn't know that she's in danger to the degree that she is, and her family is trying to keep this knowledge from her. But in fact, she's in very grave danger, and her family is sort of becoming impoverished, trying to protect her. And at the same time, what was happening culturally, politically in Hungary was that despite the fact that Jews were being sent to these forced labor camps, which were the conditions of which were horrific to the point that half of the men who were in these camps died, at least half, more than half in many cases, depending on where they were sent. Hungary was considered a safe place for Jews, and Jews from other occupied nations fled to Hungary because Hungarian Jews were not being deported. Miklos Horthy, the regent of Hungary, did not want to deport Hungarian Jews because despite the fact that he was deeply anti-Semitic in certain ways, he recognized the importance of Jews to Hungary's economy and culture. And so he refused to deport Jews, and he also refused to exclude Jews culturally to the degree that other occupied nations or other nations that were allied with Germany did. And so as the war went on, and as Hungary sort of maintained its uneasy and ultimately untenable relationship with Germany, there became this kind of cultural denial, and this was both among Jews and non-Jews in Hungary, that what had happened in the occupied nations could ever happen in Hungary. Hungary's Jews would never be deported. Hungary's Jews would never be oppressed to the degree that it was rumored that Jews in the other occupied nations were being oppressed. And so, of course, when Hungary was finally occupied in March of 1944, it came as a horrific shock certainly to the Jewish people of Hungary, but also, I think, to the Hungarian non-Jews, that suddenly these deportations occurred, and they occurred with this surprising rapidity because the instruments of concentration and of extermination were so well developed by that time that, in fact, within a brief span of time, within just a few months, more than half of Hungary's Jewish population was decimated. And so both, I think that, I know before this moment, I don't know that I've really considered that parallel of the illusion of safety within the family and the illusion of safety within the country working in concert in the novel, but I'm sure that in a sense they were, because I know that that was part of the kind of zeitgeist of the moment. I mean, it had to be operating both on the smaller level of family and on the larger cultural level at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And I can finally give an answer to the question which you posed to me, which is, in a sense, the problem for the historian with partial information is, and because of quite legitimate data protection guidelines, is the difficulty of figuring out what to do with case files that just end. And of course, you can't follow up, because that would mean to contact a family who's not supposed to really understand that you're looking at these things. And the license that we have is relatively limited in terms of imagining, what are the motivations that cause someone to relinquish a child, or what happens when they finally make contact and those moments of reconciliation are left out of the records. And so I think for me it was the question as a historian of trying to write around what I had, but in a way that wasn't just about pointing out silences, right? Because that is a kind of classic dilemma of micro-historical practice, which is all of a sudden all you're learning about is silence.
Right.
I mean, the funniest version of this that I know is a few years ago, I have a piece about this coming up in the New York Review of Books, where I was looking at Charles Dickens's family and thinking about, how much we know about them, because they all were Dickens's children. But for some, families like them, there were just names on a list, and, wonder what happened to them. In Ireland a few years ago, the 1901 and 1911 census forms went online and were free. And this was unusual in that for the United States and for England, you have to pay per hit. Mm-hmm. This was completely open. Anyone could look up their family on this, but of course it meant that anyone could look up yours. In other words, free for all, so that, when I discovered, and it was late one night I discovered it, and it was almost by accident. And it might have been, I'm rather proud of it, but it could have been sort of embarrassing, that my mother's grandfather was illiterate and he wrote X. Now, some people would really hate that he wrote X. And it looks so awful, and it says he cannot read or write. It's 1901, and he writes X. But no one has any right to stop anybody else seeing that material. And so if you're writing a novel, for example, you could now, set in 1901, you could now roam through the census, just looking at handwriting, looking at names, looking at how many servants people had. You could base your novel on the family next door now, rather than on your own family. And there's nothing they can do to stop you. You can't go and get their files in other ways, but you can just get this amount of information. It's quite a lot of information sometimes, because it gives you read or write. You can trace them 10 years later. You can see how else they were living. It's a sort of novelist's dream, but it's also a snooper's dream. And maybe writing novels is a sort of snooping. Even in the characters you invent, you're sort of snooping into them. You're sort of checking them out. You're giving them qualities that are sort of, you're filling them with things that are none of your business and are all theirs. And
it is.
There is a creepy element to novelists. I like myself, because I just got trained. I went to shrinks for that purpose. But other novelists, how do you find them? I often wonder about them. Are they looking too closely at things that are none of their business?
Guilty as charged. I am working on a book right now about a real person, which is, something that someday, Colm, you and I really have to sit down and have a drink over, because it's so much harder than writing about. The Invisible Bridge came out of my family experiences, but it was very soon after I moved into those stories that I could step away from my family experiences. And in any case, there's really no historical record of my family experience, and so it's not as though some scholar can say, no, in fact, your grandfather didn't make that decision in 1937, But now I'm writing about Varian Fry and about what he did both at Harvard when he was a student there and in France in 40 and 41. And so I came across in one biography of Fry a line about a horrific crime that he committed when he was a student. Just one line, about which nothing else is written anywhere, anywhere, anywhere. And so I called the biographer and I said, where did you get this information and how can I learn more about this? And she said, well, I got it through his widow from a locked file that, was a locked file from Harvard that, I have a copy of in my attic, but I'm not going to go and get it because it's buried somewhere, so I can't possibly find it. And I could put you in touch with his daughter, but I don't think she's going to be any help because she's, concerned with taking care of her mother who's very ill. And so this piece of information that's essential to my understanding of this person about who I'm writing is in a locked file. Now, if I were a historian, this would be a terrible, a frustration beyond any frustration.
You would evolve house burglary methods.
That's right, which I have considered in any case. But in the case of a novelist, I think that's license to then to then extrapolate.
I wrote a short book about Lady Gregory, born in 1852, died 1932. A widow at the age of 40, the most respectable person in Ireland, dressed like Queen Victoria, looked after W.B. Yeats, ran Coole Park, ran the Abbey Theatre. I mean, really was considered a paragon of virtue. And unfortunately, when she had, within a year of marriage, her affair with Wilfred Scarwin Blunt, and she sent him poems at the end of the affair that he was to publish under his name, just so they would have a little secret with each other. He put that down in his diaries, which were, of course, not opened until the 1940s when she was dead, but there they are. So those poems are now in her, as well as his book, they're in her book of her selected writings. And then, unfortunately, at the age of 60, she came to America, and they're 2 weeks missing, and she was in Central Park West, as far as I can work out, in bed for most of the time with John Quinn. And she, of course, burned his letters to her, but her letters to him, which are as embarrassing as Edith Wharton's letters to Morton Fullerton. I mean, they're filled with girlish talk and how much you master me and how much I want you. I mean, and he didn't burn them, but he died suddenly, so that maybe he wanted to burn them and didn't, but there they are as well. So if you're working on anything to do with her, for example, a biography of her, but even I'm working on a play, I've written one play about her, I'm writing another. I've written one short story about her, I'm writing another. This is dynamite, this is the best fun. But one day I was so filled with myself that I thought it'd be fun to read some of this out to an audience. And of course I forgot that her granddaughter that it was a sort of an event where I stood up and we were having supper and I went up to read and talk and I spoke about all of these affairs. And her granddaughter, who she was about 16 or 17 when Lady Gregory died, and adored her grandmother. Just when I came back down, said in a wonderful accent to me, "There's somebody sitting in that chair." And I said, no, that's where I was sitting. She said, "I know, but there's somebody else sitting there now." Meaning, don't think you can come back down here and sit beside me, having done what you have done, because it was for her entirely personal. It was for her secrecy. It was for her grandmother. It was not public property. For me, it was this icon of, we could call her, she was certainly iconic. And I thought she was open season in a certain way. I still do. But, so it's a funny business, that, of venturing into the real world, where you feel that some people have quite a lot at stake in the real world. And in a way, as a novelist, you don't, or you think you have responsibilities, but you don't take them as seriously as people think you should. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do?
See, this is why we must never sit down and have a drink about this, because I'll be terrified. I can't, I have to, well, actually what I'm going to do is go to Harvard and try to get in the locked file, because there's nothing else I could do. My curiosity and my need to know about what actually happened to this person is too overwhelming to do otherwise, you know. But I think every day about that very thing you talk about, which is that in writing speculatively about the life of a real person, there is somebody living who you're going to, whose real sort of emotional territory you're going to be stepping on in a way. And there are stories. I mean, I feel like the story about this person must be told, because the things that he did in France during those 2 years were so remarkable and not nearly well enough known that they have to be told more publicly. But at the same time, you really, I think as a novelist, there's another responsibility to try to understand what motivates a person. And in this case, I think that there was such a profound change in the way that this young man behaved in the world before these events that occurred in college and afterward, that understanding those events is essential to knowing what happened later, why those things that he did could occur, why he could have become the sort of person who would have saved Marc Chagall and Hannah Arendt and Max Ernst and everyone else.
Marc Chagall, yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, right, the people whose lives are being trampled on most intimately, right, are the writers' families, as Colm is oftentimes making the point
Right.
in New Ways to Kill Your Mother and those essays. And I mean, one of the things that's curious to me for you both, and so for Julie, then the question is, how do you start with this set of circumstances that begin in the family, but then you move them outside of the family in the Invisible Bridge? For Colm, actually, it's the question of, you start with this very strong essay about the fallacy of autobiographical or of biographical knowledge and the transposition of that onto the pattern of the novel. But then actually, in a way, through the sets of essays, you're also pointing out lives, right? And so I wondered if you can both talk about that, so the question of transposition from biography to fiction. And also, what difference does a life make?
Yeah, well, beginning this book with my family's story, with things that actually happened, my grandfather received a scholarship to go from Budapest to the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris to study there for a few years, and then lost the scholarship because of some regulations that were passed in Hungary about sending money to students in foreign countries, Jewish students in foreign countries. And then, having been conscripted into forced labor when the war began, building from that story or starting with that story felt like a way into a novel. I knew that retelling that story, in a sense, was going to give rise to a novel, because it could only be a novel. But at the same time, I felt horribly constrained by it, because it had actually happened. And though there were elements of truth in the short stories that I wrote, they were really just purely stories. So they were really just the creation of character. And so I think for about the first 100 pages of this novel, as I was writing the first draft, I kind of felt a dutifulness that made the work feel a little bit heavy to me somehow. I felt like I was doing what needed to be done. I felt like I was sort of doing a good turn, in a way, by retelling these stories that I knew the family wanted told. And then, at a certain point, I realized that the story had to depart, and it was going to depart at the point where this character, this young man in Paris in the late 30s, was going to fall in love. I'm sure my grandfather fell in love in the late 30s in Paris, but those stories are lost to the family now, because the person he would have fallen in love with was decidedly not my grandmother. And so perhaps if I had been a man instead of a woman, he would have told me those other stories, but he didn't. And so that was the territory in which I began to invent. And as soon as I knew who and how he was going to fall in love with, and how he was going to fall in love in Paris, then the story took a turn toward the fictional. And that was the road that opened up into territory that was completely new, and that I think created the energy that allowed me to really write the novel, and not just to be reconstructing a story whose contours I could see from beginning to end, in a way, and that didn't have the degree of unknowability that would have been necessary to take me through the writing of a novel, And so, though it was very hard to break the news to my grandmother that the person who Andras fell in love with was not in fact her. And she's, of course, an incredibly remarkable woman in her own right, but was instead this completely fictional former ballerina. It was a terrible thing. It was a horrible conversation that I dreaded and dreaded and dreaded. And my grandmother, of course, because she's a reader, said, well, of course you're making up a story. You're writing fiction. And I thought, thank God this woman has lived in books for so much of her life and knows sort of what that's about, because it was dreadful to have to think about breaking that piece of news. And she ended up reading the book 3 times and sort of giving me some invaluable editing help, which was an act of generosity that, I don't know, maybe wouldn't have proceeded if she had been, it wouldn't have arisen if she had been, in fact, in the book in the way that characters are sort of imperfectly altered when people write about them sort of as they are.
I mean, I recognize everything you're saying, and it's absolutely an essential business, that you almost need something to start with, as though you need a sound or some beginning, but then you make up the rest. And I think this is what becomes very difficult as you're working, that if you stick to the truth, somehow the truth becomes oddly shapeless, that it doesn't fulfill some immense thing that you wish to achieve, that it gets small and flimsy almost, but that you're very close sometimes as you're working to being a child in bed musing on things. I wonder if my grandfather had gone and instead of marrying her had met a ballerina. In other words, when I wrote that novel, I was talking about the heather blazing. The best fun was, I wonder if I had no siblings at all, and if my mother died when I was born, and if it was just my father and me. Oh, and you curl up in bed as a 9-year-old thinking, wouldn't that be lovely? I could have the house to myself most of the time. None of those would be there. My mother would be annoying me. I'd just have him, and him and me would go off places. And then you actually start, I mean, it's very childlike. And you watch, when I was writing that book of essay, I find it in someone as grand and as noble as Thomas Mann. People call Buddenbrooks an autobiographical novel. Well, it isn't, in the sense that he gives himself no siblings when he had 3, he had 4. He had 4 siblings, and there were 5 of them, and he just makes himself Hanno. And of course, he imagines his own death, his own slow death by, I think it's a form of meningitis. He sort of rather enjoys describing it. But he puts in his father's death more or less exactly as it occurred. So that he mixes up all, and he puts his mother's exotic nature into the book. He puts the precise town of Lübeck, much to the horror of Lübeck, into the book, so that everyone in Lübeck hated the book, partly because so much was fantasy and so much was true. And that clearly this imagination had felt free to wander in the streets of it, making some things up and using other real things. And he did a worse thing towards the end of his life. He needed something terrible to happen in Dr. Faustus, something really awful. And his son Michael came with this absolutely beautiful child who was considered this sort of golden 2-year-old that everyone adored. And he thought, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I need a child called Echo, and I'm going to kill Echo. And his wife, all of them said to him, you can't do this. You've been doing it all your life to us, using us for bits of your book. And he went ahead, there it is, it's a wonderful, wonderful chapter, the death of the child Echo in Dr. Faustus. And later on, when she was in her 90s, Katja Mann, who was a very liberated woman, said, oh yes, that death in Venice, oh, that happened. Tommy, we were in Venice, and there was this Polish boy, he was about 11. Oh, Tommy couldn't take his eyes off him. He was on the beach all the time. And I said, oh, the cholera, no, that didn't happen. But some of the other things happened down to the second. But the business of my husband staring all the time at this very beautiful boy, all of that happened. And it was in 1910. And, we were married, and my uncle was outraged when the book came out. But there it was. That's what life was. So that, man had used so much of his secret self, had invented things, had added things, and had been cruel. I mean, had used things that really, anyone normal would not have used. But so, I mean, this is just the way we are, and people just have to put up with this.
But you make this really interesting point about Tennessee Williams not giving himself enough credit for the way in which he manipulates the story of Rose. I love that point. Actually, will you say a bit more
but
about
it's
that?
just a simple matter that
Yeah.
I think you find metaphors. That people say, oh, Tennessee Williams put his sister Rose into his place. Well, he didn't really, in the sense that he kept finding metaphors, new ways of finding a correlative or some way of putting someone who was vulnerable like Rose, damaged like Rose, but wasn't fully Rose. So it was, what he was finding, in fact, was the shape of experience, of his own experience, as though it was almost an abstract shape, and then making other versions of that shape which were closer in, better imagined, and where the colors were deeper. And so it wasn't as though, it's not fully true to say that this is not autobiographical. It is, but in a way that's intriguing and that requires you, if you're reading it, using the life and the work, to be very subtle in how you connect the two, because he was very subtle in the way he did so.
Can I follow up on that? Taking a step back and saying, so how do then these family members as patterns present different kinds of opportunities for novelists than, say, the neighbors or the friends, right?
Well, I think in the sense that Colm was talking about with, your ability to imagine what your family might have been like had it just been you and your father. And that's because we know our family so much more intimately than our neighbors, as intimately as we may know our neighbors. And so that act of novelistic extrapolation into a postulated reality is easier within our family. In How to Breathe Underwater, the short story collection, there was a short story that's about, that's called The Isabel Fish, where it's a brother and a sister who have survived the death of the brother's girlfriend, to whom the sister was also very close. And in writing this story, I think partly because, I was pretty young when I wrote the story, but also just because it was about a family that in certain ways was similar to my own. The only way for me to write that story, for me to really envision that story, was to say to myself, what if I had had a mean brother instead of a nice brother? Or what if tragedy had made my brother cruel instead of kind? And so it's that act of the pursuing of an opposite within the family, or of the pursuing of a condition that didn't exist in the family, that is both, it's both possible because you know your family so intimately, and it's also fruitful because it's different from the actual conditions, and so it creates that kind of that need, that desire for the exploration that moves you through the writing of a piece.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
And the thing that's so devastating about Isabel Fish is the kindness is contained within the cruelty, right? And so that it's almost like you needed some residual. I mean, the brother flips, but
Yeah, he
becomes more
does.
explicable in some ways.
He does become more explicable, but the mode that's sort of animating the drama of the story is his sister's pain at his cruelty, because she's obviously suffering as well, and he's sort of exacerbating her suffering, and that's not always been their history together. And so in order for the story, there was no story. I felt like there was no story in two siblings suffering in a similar way, or in a kind of nurturing way together. But two siblings suffering in a mutually destructive way together was a story,
Should we open it up to questions? Allowing people just a second to gather their thoughts.
There's somebody over there, look.
Hello. I was wondering if you participate in writers' groups with the other writers, and how that helps you, or does it?
Well, I was in a writer's group, in fact, when I was working on The Invisible Bridge. It was really a wonderful group composed of 6 or 7 novelists in San Francisco whose work I deeply admired. And the way that this group worked was that we would, one person would show a pretty good chunk of work every month or so, and the others would read and discuss. And so I was working on my draft and reading the other members' work in the group. And after about 5 or 6 readings and discussion of work, I realized that there was no way I was ever going to show any of my work to this group because it was, first of all, it was in a state of generation. And at a certain point, I realized that I had to get through a draft on my own before I could show it to anybody else. And then once I had gotten through that draft, I realized that there was so much work that I knew that I needed to do on that book before I showed it, before it made sense for me to show it to anyone. That it was yet another year before I did. And so, in fact, I was in the writers group for about a year without ever showing any of my work, gladly reading everyone else's work, but realizing that having been through writers' workshops at Iowa and at Stanford, I never wanted to show any of my work while it was in a state of generation again. And so it was 3 years before I showed the draft to anybody, and then it was just to my husband, and then 2 other readers read it before I showed it to my editor, and that was it. And I think that in the sense of creating a motivating force behind actually getting pages done, writers groups can be incredibly helpful. And I have a number of friends in Brooklyn who are in these very vital and thriving writers groups, but not since the program at Stanford have I been able to do such a thing myself.
I just maybe I should say something about Ireland. I love being in America. I remember being in Yaddo, where I was trying to write a book, which is the artist residence in upstate. And if you wanted eggs, you had to be in by 8:30 in the morning. And so I would hear the showers beginning, and everyone was sort of young, and they were all... I thought the showers were going for a long time. In Ireland, we don't wash ourselves as intensively as that, I think. And all around, I could hear the hot water. And then everyone would arrive in about 8:15, and everyone would be both washed and cheerful. And I couldn't believe this, because in Ireland, at 8:15, some people might be washed, but they wouldn't be cheerful, and people might be cheerful, but they wouldn't be washed. But mostly you'd be neither in a way, And that if I had joined a writers' group in Ireland when I was starting, we would have, I don't know what would have happened, we would have laughed so much at each other, we would have done so much damage to each other, we would have gossiped about each other, we would have done a lot of backbiting, we would have prevented books. I could have stopped Roddy Doyle at a crucial moment. I don't think that's very funny, that commitments book that you're trying to write about a band. No one is that interested in a band, Or with Anne Enright, I could have said, I don't feel that some of your women are really a bit rough. Why don't you make them nice? And they could have done much worse things to me. But why can't you write about now instead of the 50s? Why are you locked into all those years that no one cares about? And we could have all spent our time sort of punishing each other. And it could have been really evil. Instead, what happened was that when I published my first book, in those 2 or 3 years, about 10 people around who were, some were younger, some a bit older, all of us published our first books. And what we did was we all read each other, and we found ourselves reading with each other, paid a lot of attention to each other, and everyone realizing whatever you're doing, I'm not doing. Each of us doing something very different. Right. It was supportive in an interesting way then, but without ever having to hand chapters over to people for their opinion on them. Oh no, you're not getting that. But I did, because I worked as a journalist, I was so used to working for deadlines that I did have to create deadlines, to say to 2 friends in particular, look, if I have this chapter finished by Sunday, can I give it to you? And will you read it over a week and then give it back to me, so that I could have some system? Why, especially with a novel, why should I go on with this? And luckily my 2 friends, especially one of them, was so nice that no matter what I wrote, he said, it's great, keep going. And I believed him, even though some of it was rubbish, So that you need something. You need a first reader. Right. I don't think you can work alone, but maybe some countries would lend themselves easier. I mean, Brooklyn, there are probably sweet writers all meeting together, being so sweet to each other. But where I'm from, I'm afraid not. It wouldn't be like that, no.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. You used a term early on. I was curious about. You talked about releasing energy, and I got the feeling you were talking about more than narrative friction. I was wondering if you could just talk about what you meant when you talked about releasing energy as you're writing.
Do you want me to do it? Do you want to talk?
We can both talk about it.
You start.
I'll start. Okay. I mean, I talk about this in those terms with students when they ask me, as if I'll really be able to answer this question, what is conflict in a novel? And I talk about the fact that conflict in a novel is not a problem. It's a problem that becomes so untenable to the players in that problem that there's this accrual of energy that builds to a point that it has to be released. And so a character makes a decision, usually a poor decision, that causes the release of some of this narrative energy and the unfolding of events that then cause another problem that becomes so untenable that events unfold again through this release of energy. And in the traditional shape of a novel, these accruals and releases of energy occur in a pattern that sort of builds and builds to a big one. And I think that, I mean, that in part was what we were talking about in a sense, but I think it also has to do with the energy of writing and the fact that certain kinds of problems among characters or within a narrative will cause a kind of build up and then release of creative energy as well that lead to further narrative exploration, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that in other words, it's a crucial way of trying to read and trying to write and trying to think about that. That in other words, if you say, oh, do I read a novel in order to find out how to live? Well, not necessarily. Do I read a novel in order to like or dislike characters? Well, not necessarily. So what is it then? That in other words, I was finding, it's in the first essay of this book called New Ways to Kill Your Mother, that people were writing about Fanny Price in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park and her aunts as though they were real, as though they were people they knew. Right. Claire Tomlin does it in her biography of Jane Austen, and Lionel Trilling had done it. They were calling people odious. And I was thinking, this is missing the point, that the Aunt Bertram in Mansfield Park releases certain energies. For example, by making the sofa her realm and by seeming to be so inert, she's allowing certain other energies to be released in the book. By Fanny being sent to the house by her mother, being orphaned, that is a release of energy for Fanny in the book. And that if you see the book, instead of being, for example, its terms being dictated by moral questions, that it doesn't teach us how to live, but see it in relation, say, to something to do with physics, that a pattern is being created, a dynamic is being created, and that it's our job as readers to try and study the texture of that, study how the forces work within the novel. Then that will help us to read the novel better, maybe, than the other ways. So that idea of a novel as a release of, as Julie was saying, as a release of certain energies and then uncertain ones, and then further release of them. And this may merely be at times in the rhythm of a sentence, in the change of a rhythm of a sentence, but it can also be in the way in which a character in a novel actually has a dynamic or an energy which can shift and change and seem to have more substance and more colour and an ambiguous force seeming to both move forward and reverse at the same moment, which if you were looking at under a microscope would be utterly fascinating if you were a scientist. So I mean, that was my idea. I mean, and I think we're talking about exactly the same thing, that in order to stop the reader, or stop yourself even as a reader, reading characters in novels as though you could like them or dislike them, to try and find some other way to read them, this idea of a release of energy would be one way. I mean, there may be others, but at least that is one way of helping us to get away from that idea of who to like or dislike in a novel.
Brief follow-up.
Yeah.
Control, do you as an author feel like you control the character's energy?
Oh, I think, I don't know, absolutely. In other words, you are there, and you see, you're no longer the puppet master because you're using instinct. You're using some sort of force of your own to force this, to see if you can connect the thing. So it's quite intense work. It's deliberate work, but it's not necessarily manipulation as a puppeteer will manipulate a puppet, because these forces are so inchoate or so difficult to define. By just managing them, you're actually doing a lot of work, but it takes a lot of work to do that within a pattern without making the pattern too apparent to the reader, without opening up the pattern as an obvious one, allowing texture to have within it a great ambiguous force as much as, say, where you can trace a pattern too easily. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and there's actually a neuroscientific model for this, which is that when we make decisions, the more complex the decision, the poorer we are at making the decision correctly if we consider all of the factors that are involved in the decision. So, for example, people are good at making decisions like, should I wear a raincoat or not on a particular day given the uncertainty of the weather pattern? You can sort of lay out the possible factors and make that decision well. But people are much worse at making decisions like, should I marry this particular person, based upon lists of pros and cons, because our reasons for making decisions that are that complex are not fully consciously graspable by our minds. In other words, we are in possession of the faculties to make those decisions, but we're not necessarily possessed of the ability to be conscious of all of the elements of that decision. And the more that we try to become conscious of all of the reasons for those complex decisions, the more we fail at them. And the same holds true for novel writing and for short story writing, but particularly, I think, for novel writing, when all of those forces that you're trying to control are so complex and are so minutely interlinked that to actually try consciously to manipulate them would really undermine them.
Yeah, and there's a brilliant account of this actually in an interview that Francis Bacon did with David Sylvester, where he's talking about making a mark with paint and how much chance is involved. That if you go through all the factors, I need some yellow here, I need it to be like this, you'd get it so wrong. Whereas if you just trust it for a second, just do it, you might get it right. And they start comparing it to roulette. And then David Sylvester starts comparing it to a ball game where you're throwing a ball. And if you just stop thinking for a minute, and anyone that plays tennis will know this, stop thinking when you're playing tennis and just let something else happen. And the ball might get in for a change. You might get an ace finally. Yeah. Does that make any sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question about why family patterns then matter in this issue of transfer and release of energy? Because it strikes me that it's this way of radically shifting, whether it's identification or empathy or sympathy that the reader has. I mean, Blackwater Lightship, especially, I think that you're set up in a way to take Helen's side and then you shift, at least the reader's sympathy shifts to Lily, so that Helen's position almost becomes incomprehensible. I don't know if this is at all the intention that you had, or I'm thinking in The Invisible Bridge that there are those moments when Andras seems always on the verge of letting out Clara's secret, right? He's feckless in some ways. He's talking to everyone. Mm-hmm. And so you allow the sympathies just sort of drain away very quickly. Mm-hmm.
I suppose if you use a confined space, which is a family, which is effectively a confined space, where every word is open to question, where love, for example, well, yes, members of the family love each other. We just take that for granted. It's elemental, it's blood, it's all that. And then every so often they hate each other. And every so often someone says something so vicious to somebody else, but then that person might seem to be terrible. They're just defending themselves within a dynamic. And that dynamic can change so easily within a room where someone seems to have taken power to themselves in a way which is unnecessary and intolerable. And they don't even need the power they've taken. And then so you can then offer it to somebody else slowly. So leaving the person who seemed so powerful 20 pages ago, oddly powerless now because of some change you have made in the way that you have moved things. But if you leave it stable, you get nothing at all. Right. You know, in other words, that if I had King Lear for a week, I would certainly make Goneril and Regan good at a certain point and have Cordelia do something deeply unpleasant.
Yeah, and I think the reason you can exercise all of those complex manipulations effectively within the context of family is because we know them so deeply. We live them from the moments of our birth, you know? And so when you're dealing with elements of that degree of complexity, it helps if you're proceeding from that almost archetypally known experience, you know? And so that's one of the reasons I think we're obsessed with writing about families, just that it gives us the perfect playing ground for those interchanges of energy that would be almost impossible to construct if it weren't for those schemas of family that underlie all of those manipulations.
And for both of you, I think it's fair to say distance is far more fruitful than repression.
The distance is more fruitful than repression.
I mean, as a position from which you start. I mean, it's notable to me as a reader.
I like repression as well, though.
You don't have as much repression, though. You've got a lot more distance, no?
I don't know. I think that in that novel, there's a lot of emotion held in, not mentioned, forces that cannot be said. You know, that things are just
one person repressing another person, not internal repression.
Oh yes, I mean.
In other words, it's emotional distance between people, not repression amongst them. That's what I'm getting at.
Yes, that emotional distance, especially within a family, can be very powerful to use in fiction, because of course proximity is there in other ways, and so you're playing with a dynamic. You're playing with something that comes two ways. You know, that first it's simple, that these people are very close because they were brought up together and they're from the same tribe or the same house, but then somehow they're far away from each other just now, and you've got to work between the two. So it's a much more interesting space than if they just happen to have, than say, I would find a divorce. I couldn't do divorce. I wouldn't be interested in it at all, because we'd just be two people who just got fed up of each other and went away from each other and disliked each other finally. Well, yeah, but so what? Whereas the family thing, meaning that no matter what you do, you know, you're the blood. If someone took a sample of your blood, they would find that it was like their blood. So divorce, I couldn't do divorce. I wouldn't do divorce. I have no interest in divorce. But divorce within a family of two members of a family, deeply finding that in a year of their lives they couldn't even look at each other. Ooh, I'd be very interested in that.
Colm, I was interested in what you were saying about the ambiguity of returning home a little bit earlier, and I guess thinking particularly of Brooklyn, there's the kind of striking returning of home. There's this tension that the character has developed and then returns home and then seems to slip easily back into this this sense of comfort, and there's this tension for the reader, I think. And I'm just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, it's mainly autobiographical. It's mainly being from this town of 6,000 people and spending a lot of time, say, here or in Spain, and finding this very funny thing that I think anyone Irish who lives in America knows, that when you go to JFK to get that flight home to Dublin, you know, it's usually the evening, blood sugar levels are low, you're sort of susceptible in some way or other, and suddenly you join all the Irish getting on the plane and you're home. You're sort of with them. It mightn't last long. The air hostesses, everyone on the plane, there's this whole feeling of us now. We don't have to worry anymore. We're all back together again. And then you arrive home. And you could arrive home and everyone could love you, you know, when you arrive and long to see you. And then you'd find that after a day, they would decide that you hadn't been anywhere, that you hadn't been in America. And they'd start talking about neighbours and things that had happened locally. And every time you'd say, well, of course, in New York, we don't, like this great... And they'd say, oh, New York. And they would sort of, your being away didn't interest them, that they wanted you back the way you were. And then you're back up in your old bedroom, and suddenly you start to shiver. And you wonder, how long more will this last? And if you add alcohol to this, by the way, it's really dynamite. But if you add just, some secret that hasn't been told to it, as in Brooklyn, where she can't tell her mother, and her mother keeps pretending that she's going to stay, but knowing all the time that she's not. That, knowing the letters are coming, that sort of, so that they actually cease to connect, except in the elemental way. And every day becomes almost a drama between them over how much can be said and how much must be concealed. And if you are telling the story from the point of view of one of the characters only, I think this is important here, that you give a point of view to only one of them, so that everything comes through her eyes. Therefore, you begin to be her, and you begin to feel the claustrophobia of her situation without being able to realize that maybe her mother is suffering just as much. And so you just work with it in detail after detail after detail of how nosy her mother is. Her mother pretends she doesn't know things that she knows. Her mother wanting her home really badly. Her mother being unable to say so. Her desperate to get away, or maybe one day desperate to stay, and you just move it and move it and move it. But it's sentence by sentence by sentence, where you don't even begin with a grand plan. All you do is try and make the next sentence faithful to something or other you're working with. That might be a variation on it. It's slightly close to what Cézanne perfected in those brush strokes, where you can see the brush strokes. There's a variation in each of them. They make up a pattern eventually, but you can see each one being made. And if you work like that without the grand plan, one by one the sentences, and see where they take you, but that the hope is you will get some overall picture which will have enough pattern in it to hold the reader emotionally for long after the book's been put down. I mean that is the aim of the enterprise.
Just to follow. So there is no kind of reconsideration in the kind of coming home. There's no sense that perhaps exile was a mistake in any way.
Oh, there is, and then there's not. In other words, the first day, there's an absolute feel sometimes when I would go back to Dublin that this is real, that everything I'm touching, the furniture, the voices, the actual rooms, I belong in them. And why have I been away? And we're not nomads, there are nomads in the world, but generally we're not. We like to have 2 rooms or 3 in which we're most comfortable. We like to sleep in the same beds generally. And so you're using that idea that someone goes back into a pure comfort zone, as in comfort food and everything familiar. And then you try and break that, see if there's any way to break that, to give somebody the feeling of, I want that so badly, and I don't. So wanting it badly is no use. But if you add "and I don't" to wanting it, then you get a novel.
My question is for Colm. I was wondering in Blackwater Lightship, with this novel with 3 really amazing women, amazing mothers, how you chose to focus the story through Helen's point of view rather than one of the other women, or even Declan.
There's a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter, and the daughter is the one that got away. She went to Dublin, she's principal of a school, she's her own family, she sees them from outside. Right. Part of this was that I had been looking at Electra and looking at the way in which Electra was alone, connected to her brother who had disappeared, wanting to actually get her mother and choke her. Right. and filled with anger and rage, but somehow alone with her voice. And that if I could bring that down to a provincial Irish setting, take all the Greek thing out of it, and just take its bones and work with it, that she was the one who was most outside them all, and tell it only from her point of view, because her brother is dying, her brother's friends just arrive and they don't see everything, but she's the one who notices everything. She's watchful, she's suspicious, she's almost a novelist in the way she studies them all, and then try and see if I could undermine her, where make her seem the most unyielding of all of them. Where at the beginning she looks like the softest one, the sanest one, the one who most should be given control of these people, and then slowly take that away from her. So almost by the end, it's her grandmother, her mother, seem to be in ways more interesting than she is, more ambiguous, richer in their maybe sensibilities, that she is the one you least like. If I now go into the thing I hate talking about, liking, but she's the one you least trust, maybe, or she's the one whose energy is the slackest, or the one that's easiest to read, whereas the other women become much harder to read, just to go back to the energy issue. So that was the reason for doing that. That was the idea behind it.
Thank you.
Shall we wind things up? Is there anything that's come out of the discussion further to say?
No, I was so happy to hear you answer those questions. I'm mentally note-taking.
Thank you both so much. It was
Thank you,
tremendously
Deborah.
interesting. and
Thanks very
you
much.
for
Thank you.
the audience.
Thank you.